to the SSPX Podcast. Today, in the third part of our ongoing series, Digital Dangers, we continue exploring the effects of modern technology on our lives, particularly our mental and spiritual health. As discussed in the last episode, technological tools such as smartphones and state-of-the-art search engines like Google grant us unprecedented access to nearly unlimited information. In addition, algorithms and tracking software lead us through a sea of content calibrated exactly to our interests, which keeps us fixed to our devices. In this episode, we will discuss why this is dangerous and what we can do to place ourselves on guard against an overwhelming amount of content, much of which is misleading and potentially harmful. Ultimately, we'll ask, how do we separate the digital wheat from the chaff? Let's join Father Kopek right now.
All right, Father, welcome back. This is the third episode of our technology series. Maybe to recap before we jump in again, we were talking at the end of episode 2 about the different kinds of effects of digital technology. So we're going to explore some different angles today, but by way of introduction, can you summarize where we left off?
Sure, yeah. So I think up to this point, basically what we've discussed is more kind of like the neurological and psychological effects that we have in just using screens and technology. So it kind of brings about this, habitual disposition of ease and kind of the shallow thinking and all of that. But then also the idea of it kind of overstimulating and making it more difficult for us to just think balancedly and not just have things scrambled up by an overuse of a type of technology that in its kind of very nature is something that's beyond kind of a more intentional regulation of use. So that's basically what we've established so far, is that okay, just using these things are already going to bring about pretty likely, if not inevitable, side effects, especially to our just our psychology and our balance. But now I think we're going to move on before we get into some more of the big moral questions, which will be the episodes ahead.
Yes.
We're going to talk a bit more about kind of the influence, more the intellectual influence that we come across from from constantly accessing the feeds and the different culture, let's say, that comes with technology, and then when I say intellectual influence, I guess the influence on just our principles of thought and how we reason and how we judge things. All of these things are being acted upon by the technology itself, by the people who run it, and then by the different voices and commentators that we listen to or take in or just kind of absorb.
Sure. And so part of this has to do, or maybe a large part of it has to do with, let's say, who's behind the screen. So we've talked about the screen. You want to talk now about
who's on the other side.
Yes, in a couple different ways. Right. I think you're going to posit there are no accidents.
Right.
Here.
Yeah,
so,
that's what it comes down. And it almost kind of feels like there is. I think there's a sort of natural naivety about just kind of pulling it up and be like, oh well, this is interesting. Look how this popped up and whatever it is. When really, when we're talking about something that's digital, there are no accidents. Yeah, like you said, it's everything that's on that screen was intended to be there, and it's intended for you, even in particular, to see.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's start there. How?
Okay.
Yeah. Who is behind the screen?
Right. Well, there's not just a one.
There's
who,
not.
That's,
right. That's right.
Sure.
So where? Yeah.
We can say, generally speaking, that if you're in the world, if you're in like the business, the economy of technology, you're getting income, you're getting money from someone else's attention.
Sure.
And so the goal of someone who's going to have anything to do with whether it's an application or a video is going to be to achieve as much attention from others as possible.
Sure.
And so who's behind the screen? Well, I guess it depends on what exactly on the screen we're talking about. But even just more abstractly than that, before we can kind of get into particulars, and we could talk about just the technology that's being used to keep our attention. So this is the whole world of, let's say, like persuasive technology. So, in past decades, that only extended as far as, commercials and ads on a magazine or something like that. But when we talk about persuasive technology in the sense of the digital world, we're talking about technology that's being used to persuade us, even manipulate us to continue to use it, or to, steer us towards a particular type of product or thinking or whatever it is. And I think one of the main ways that happens is just kind of like this whole world of algorithms, for example. I think is a basic kind of technological thing to think about. So that means an algorithm in the technological sense is it's sort of like a series of rigorous instructions that's programmed into a program or a computer or a phone to perform a particular type of computation. So it's kind of like if someone clicks on this, well then open up the door to this and this and this, and then if someone clicks on that, well then it'll lead you to this and this and this, and so it's just like it's kind of like mapping, our different interests and things like that to then present to us what it's computed to find most likely that we're going to click on. So like an easy example to explain how an algorithm works is if you have like a music streaming app, like iMusic or Spotify or something like that, what those are programmed to do is that the moment you search a song, you've now entered into their algorithm, and it's going to compute and present to you, based on your selections, the different artists or the different genres of music that you're likely to find interest in. And so it's no accident that you might search a particular singer and then later on it suggests someone else to you. Like, wow, I like this guy too. Yeah. That's how it works. In the marketing world, algorithms are the ones that run over that. So Google is one massively trained algorithm, and it's not just the most likely result you get when you type in a Google search, for example. It's going to be based on where you are, what's been mapped already in your particular interests, what the algorithm has been able to track as far as even your race, your religion, all those things are going to determine what Google is going to suggest to you when you type in it's already going to start suggesting things based on that. Which in a sense, if we think about it, it is a type of manipulation. It doesn't have to be something that we automatically presume is insidious. And yet when we're dealing with, an economic world that wants our attention and knows that, the best way to gain someone's attention is not necessarily in anything moral. We are walking into a world where everything's kind of stacked against us, and there's massive amounts of computations that are all tracking every move, literally, not in a conspiratorial sense, but this is just how networks work and the digital world works to get us to continue to follow what they want us to.
And part of this false promise is that it's true, right? Meaning you do find sometimes an artist that, that's someone I didn't know of, or it is more convenient, like in a certain way, all technology or labels, it is true to an extent, right? It's not a conspiracy.
It's really good at what it does, right? And it can be very beneficial to us because we might start searching for a particular type of sock or something like that, and right away it's that's exactly what I was looking for. Well, there's a reason why it's good at producing that sort of result. It does get a little bit more, worrisome kind of the deeper you go into it. I guess what I mean is there's a lot more going on underneath than we usually presume. Right. So for example, I think most people might be surprised to know that, if you have a function on your phone that's Hello Siri or OK Google, we kind of instinctively think that's kind of like a human being. If you ask it a question, then it starts listening and answers your question. Well, no, not really. It's even legally in the terms of use that it's always recording, because a phone doesn't just hear its name and then wake up. It can't work like that. So it's constantly recording everything that you're saying, everything that's going around you outside of your pocket. And not only is it going to then be able to respond when you ask it a question, but it's taking all of that information and it's feeding it right into the algorithms. So perhaps
all in the name of helping you.
All in the name of helping you, and also in helping the people that are paying to have their algorithms tie in and their products tie into those results. So you might have had that kind of freaky experience when you're talking about something like, I was really interested in this particular type of clothing or something like that. And then the next time you open Amazon, there it is. Like, whoa, wow, that's how on earth that happened. Well, it happened because it heard you say it and it typed it and sent it into the thing, and there you get the result. So that's kind of worrisome.
Well, it definitely feeds into what you were talking about, attention spans, and it's designed to keep us interested in the things we're interested in.
And it's, in a sense, it's designed to keep us consuming.
Yeah,
for sure.
Certainly.
Yeah. So it's that's just something I think we just need to be aware of. That there's a lot more going on, and it is very good at its persuasion, just as good as it is making things easy for us. But on the one hand, that making things easy for us is just going to feed right back into that kind of habitual disposition that we're talking about, kind of that just shallow lack of needing to work for things or information. But on the other hand, we do reasonably have to question, what else is all this going to be used for? Like, it's one thing for marketing to suggest, a pair of socks to me, but everything else that I might be saying is going to be tracked for some reason or another. And I don't mean to get conspiratorial, but it's a fact that our movements in the digital world are constantly tracked. So that's something to be aware of, and that technology is only getting better with the dawn of artificial intelligence and all that sort of thing. That's taking algorithms and multiplying it by 1 billion and creating a machine that can not only track your movements and compute the best possible scenario, but also learn from, in a sense, learn in quotation marks, in a way that it adjusts itself. So there's a lot of really good technology, and it's worth us realizing that. I think basically the main conclusion is that we are less the agents in the use of these things than we usually like to think we are. Meaning it's more active on us, and we are more passive to it than the other way around. And that putting ourselves in a state of passivity, that's putting ourselves in the state of being influenced, whether that's by the current fad, the fashion, or things more insidious, or even just the culture and consumerism or otherwise.
So we're being formed even when we think we're in control.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, so how do we balance that with other considerations?
Okay, well, I think just on the level of the use of the technology, our balance is going to be very. It's going to start with being much more intentional in our use of the things. Not just settling for kind of letting everything just be decided for us. It's going to be, basically what it's going to come down to is just an intentional practice of virtue when it comes to spending and entertainment and all of these things, and a greater awareness on, what we're allowing our devices to do, to look in further into, what we're agreeing to when we just click on the agreement of terms, etc. It's basically the most basic idea of just being more virtuous and more prudent in our use of technology, and realize that I can't take anything for granted, and I do have to actively look into each thing's individual worth and the value of me using it and things like that. The next step after this is when we get into being aware of being influenced, and again that's the cultural influence, let's say, that we're putting ourselves in passivity to. So the world on the digital network is by and large looking for worldly goals and not supernatural goals. It's by and large looking for superficial goals and values, and not something more intrinsic and human. And that especially affects the youth. And I think we're gonna wait to kind of like talk more about just all the particular influences on young people. But already we can kind of mention, the moment you open up, whether it's a shopping app or an entertainment app, and we're entering into the world of fads, the world of click to accept friends, of styles, of name brands, of followings, of likes, and all these things, which are largely superficial. And for a child that doesn't necessarily have the ability to, and by child I can mean even young adults, that doesn't necessarily have the ability to distinguish the difference between that and real life, that major and constant influence starts to become real life for them. And I think, at the basic level, that's why we're seeing this kind of lack of reality in adolescence, especially. There's a superficial world they live in, and values that are not real in themselves, but they seem very real to them because that's the influence that they're being inundated with. And that culture influence, again, something to talk about in the future. It is, at the end of the day, it is disordered, and it becomes pornographic very quickly, even in, let's say, softer ways, but in a way that's kind of breaking down our barriers. And that's something to be very aware of. Kind kind of one step up from that, I guess, is we have to be aware of, with the reality of gaining our attention. The things that are most often presented to us are going to be things that are, something that sparks our interest or even, stirs up emotion or whatever it is. And I mean, that's, without stepping into it, that's the whole world of news and fake news and just this spread of untruth that's constantly getting people to go back to it and listen to it and then get all worked up about it. Largely, it might not be even true at all, or obviously there's going to be at least little things that are manipulated. And it's all kind of just creating this collective naivety that is having its influence on us. So that's all something that's worth realizing, thinking about, and kind of being intentional and active against. Because if we put ourselves in passivity to that, well then, I mean, we're kind of allowing ourselves to be influenced by it.
Sure.
So that's, I think, kind of just the basic level.
Okay.
Whereas step 2 is going to be now like the more intellectual influence that we're going to deal with.
So let's dive into the intellectual influence.
Okay.
Because I think probably most people feel some kind of tension where, so for instance, we do live in an age of massive distrust, often with good reason, and yet we have more voices to listen to
than we've ever had before.
Yeah, so it's kind of a unique paradox.
Right.
People throw it out lightly, but it is kind of unprecedented in human history.
For sure.
And any of us could have access to any opinion that we wanted. So it ties into who's behind the screen, and that's part. Again, depending on how you look at it, the other part is everyone.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
We're all. So,
and that's the paradox, especially that I think came about with, like the American Constitution, for example, and some of the quote unquote rights that it enabled. So on the one hand, we have the ability to spread truth and define, a lot of great resources because we're allowed to publish them. But on the other hand, the dark side of the paradox is so does everyone else. Yeah. So does everyone else as far as posting whatever they want.
Sure.
And we have just as much likelihood to run into truth as we do, perhaps more so, run into error. So
sure. So let's talk about that influence then.
Okay. So I mean, what it comes down to, there are a lot of things, like we've been saying, that we can listen to, that we can read, and it is definitely more dangerous than we might think. And the danger comes down to putting ourselves in a state of passivity, meaning receptivity to someone else's principles, someone else's reasonings, someone else's values. So by principles, I can mean obviously someone's principles can be very bad, but what I mean is, what are they basing their judgments off of? Like, what is the principle that's dictating how I'm going to judge and comment on this thing? Are they the highest principles, for example? Because that's how we want to think. We want to base our judgments off of the highest principle. That's the perennial example of the great doctor of the church, St. Thomas Aquinas, who everything that you can ask him, he's going to say, okay, what's the highest principle? And we can work our way down there and make a valid judgment of this. Or is it rather more thinking that's just on a basic level more reactionary, or something that's more just political, or something definitely that's more, emotional? Whatever it is, when we're listening to someone, we're being informed by that speaker's principles. And if we're not actively, paying attention and critiquing, in a sense, what they're saying, then we're kind of letting it in. And in some cases, we really are letting it in, especially the more we identify ourselves with whomever we're listening to. That's kind of the danger of being passive to someone's principles. One step down from there is the reasoning that they have based on those principles, how they think, how they respond, what they value. Those things will influence our reasoning, our responses, our values, especially, again, insofar as we're putting ourselves, in passivity to them. So conscious, just freely listening, freely accepting, and not making our own distinctions. This is morally relevant. It's not just how am I supposed to know? Well, if that question's there, that's a prudence question that we have to answer, because we are responsible for what we let in. Whether that's just I'm responsible for getting myself all worked up and losing my peace of soul because I've listened to the news all day, Two, I might be responsible for a more wishy-washy way of thinking because I've been listening to some just emotional reactionary commentary all day. So we're responsible for that. If I end up making a poor decision, and all I've done up to this point, or the majority of what I've done up to this point, has been letting in, wishy-washy principles. Okay, well, that's on me. And sure, obviously I'm not saying that we just lock ourselves in a basement and not listen to anything, because we do make concessions on things, like
Sure.
like an analogy of life is like, well, that's not very good for you to eat. It's like, well, okay, well, I'm not eating it all the time, but I can make a concession. There's a reason for that. But when it comes to our intellect, especially insofar as this could be affecting our faith, our peace of soul, or our spiritual life, those concessions need to be a lot more prudentially necessary than just having something to listen to. So that's the fear.
Okay.
That we're basing the kind of this
Sure.
critique on. Concretely, the answer, let's say, is as far as like how are we supposed to think, in contradistinction to maybe faulty principles or reactionary thinking. Well, we know first of all that we always have to be aware of just basing our decisions off of emotion. We know, second of all, that it takes time and study and effort to know and to be informed by the deepest and what we can call the most simple principles, meaning that they can be applied to a large amount of things in order to judge best on many things. We have to remind ourselves that our reasoning must be precise, so not just based on personal attack, not just based on circumstances taken out of context. Ultimately, it has to be precise based on just the full reality
Sure.
of everything that exists, and especially the faith. And what that means is precise reasoning is good reasoning. Imprecise reasoning is faulty reasoning.
Sure.
And it's easier.
Yeah.
And that's why we can fall prey to it. So our reasoning must be precise. And lastly, as far as all that goes, our goals, are the things that we're working towards, the things that we're intending, and ultimately the things that are dictating, all my actions to reach that goal. Ultimately, they have to be supernatural, meaning they have to have some bearing on God's will, God's glory, and my salvation. And every other thing that we're working towards or learning or taking in has to be subordinated to that supernatural goal. Supernatural charity, which involves self-denial and the practice of virtue, following the law of God, both according to nature that he created and the laws that he revealed. That's how we're meant to be thinking.
Yeah.
And we're not going to find a lot of that, let's say, the farther we go from commentary or a speaker, the more further removed from the church and the supernatural economy of salvation, the less we're going to find that. And again, if we put ourselves just receptive to those ways of thinking, to put it kind of silly, we're kind of making ourselves dumber. If that's what we're sucking in all the time, we're making ourselves more shallow thinkers. We're becoming used to thinking with lower principles. I don't necessarily mean evil principles, but just lower principles with lower goals. And again, we could be the ones, and we are the ones responsible for that. What we're letting in, how we're letting ourselves be informed.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a kind of litmus test that any of us could do based on what you just said. Maybe this is better towards the end or a conclusion, but if we acknowledge that we're being formed one way or another, and we acknowledge or at least understand that our principles are going to be shaped by what we, to use modern parlance, consume, is there a way to look back, let's say after a week or even an episode or a month of listening to something and ask, well, are my principles clearer now? Did that help? Did it help my peace of soul? Is there a kind of, because I think a lot of times, again, especially because of the multiplicity of options, people of goodwill understandably start listening to a certain podcast or certain kind of content like news, and it's done like subspecies bonum, right? It's done like, I think I should be aware of this, or I think I should stay up on this. But is there a kind of like like an examination of conscience one can do to be like, okay, well, did that really help me understand the principles? Does it kind of does it fit in with the principles I already know as a Catholic or as
I think there are basically three solid questions we can ask ourselves.
Okay.
The first is, after listening to these things, one, how's my peace of soul?
Okay.
Did that agitate me? Did that make me fearful, or did that resonate with what I know to be true and say, okay, I can act off of this? Because if it is just agitating, chances are already this is not worth us putting into our head, even if it seems important. So for example, it might be worthwhile to know the different events going on in the world. Yeah. But subjectively, if that's just making me fearful and panicky and just, having to listen to more news and keeping me from just praying trustfully to God, my Father, that's a problem. And it's not worth you then listening to the events of the world, even if they might have some bearing on you. Okay. So question 1, peace of soul. Question 2 would be, I think, we can ask ourselves, as far as what I'm listening to, do I know the Catholic principle, that would correspond to whatever is being talked about? Do I know how I would judge this? Maybe even do I know where I would look this up? But just whatever kind of information we're talking, maybe it's a question of justice, maybe it is a question of war, maybe it's some other question of morality. We can ask ourselves, we can just examine ourselves. Do I know what the Catholic answer is to this? And if I don't, do I know where to start looking for it? And if I don't, well then that's where I need to start before I let more of this in.
Got it.
The last, and I guess kind of tied into both of them, the last kind of question is, does this benefit my spiritual life? So our peace of soul, let's say, is the foundation for our spiritual life. It's kind of that psychological balance. But when I say, does this help my spiritual life? Is the conclusion, is the effect of me listening to this person or another, does it help me? Does it push me towards deepening my prayer life, making time and room for spiritual reading, wanting to go to mass and receive the sacraments and things like that, or not? Is it on the other hand, maybe just becoming a substitute for those things because it seems like there's some sort of moral quality about them that's good. Sure. But at the end of the day, if this isn't in some way inspiring me to deepen or to pursue and to make better my spiritual life, it's not worth it. It's not good. And I think if we were to look at all three of those questions continuously and kind of compare them up against what we're listening to, that would be a pretty good way to judge the prudence of what I'm reading, what I'm listening to.
I think that's very helpful. And then from the other side, so that's what we can do kind of as examination of conscience for ourselves. But then from the outside, maybe to help establish a principle, certainly in better days, the church had things like the Index of Forbidden Books.
Right. Which is kind of one of those, no one wants to talk about that, or it seems like a dark part of the history, but it's not. I mean, if we think about this, is exactly the church and her concern for souls throughout the centuries said, you are forbidden without specific permission for a legitimate cause to read such and such an author, even if it was just a work of literature. Why? Sure. Because the church knows, not everyone has access to or the ability to deepen, a theological education, things like that. And so to avoid her children being swept away by a false ideology or a false interpretation or something like that, it just don't read it. And that was the law of the church. And that was charity. Sure. That sort of protection. Yeah.
So maybe you can speak to how that applies today, because in better times, the church did not, let's say, allow or did not promote the free marketplace of ideas. Mm-hmm. And yet we don't live in good times. No. Not just the fact that the index doesn't exist, as such anymore, or that there's a crisis in the church. But if we're going to talk about, or we are talking about all these voices, the influence, the formation it has on us, how can you apply, let's say, that Catholic mindset of the church in better days, having whether it's the index or not, having a way to judge or help basically make sure that what is put in front of Catholics is helpful and it does, give you the right principles, peace of soul, all the things that flow from that. How do we in 2024, realistically, what should we learn from the fact that the church used to take such measures to ensure that we're not bombarded with bad principles?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing to learn is that in particular is that we have to take measures to ensure that we're not bombarded with false principles. But those measures now are in our court, I think is the conclusion. Okay. So what that means is that it's up to us by and large. And I guess one of the reasons why we're having this discussion and ironically talking about other internet influences via a podcast.
Right.
Those measures are in our court, and we're going to do our best to examine, based on the principles of the church, the people that we're listening to, the influences that are coming across our screen, in order to best judge the prudence of, listening to them. In a sense, you can kind of think of it as like plumbing the causes, the four causes of an individual or a mindset or something like that. So, where are they coming from? What type of person is this? What sort of things do they say? What is their goal? If I honestly look at all those aspects, I can come to a prudent conclusion. This person is more or less trustworthy. So, okay, it's a political commentator.
Sure.
He's definitely ascribed to this particular political section, and his goal is to get votes. Okay, well, he might only be trustworthy in very certain realms, but I have to take everything he says with a great assault, because it's gauging someone's trustworthiness at the end of the day, and that's not a call for distrust. It's a call for active prudence, just so to examine. So I guess we could I think maybe what would help is to just kind of go through the different scenarios, kind of the different types of influence that we're kind of usually asked about as priests.
Perfect.
Usually kind of have to make our distinctions of, because I don't know, thinking about how I think we can kind of sum it up into a few general categories. And instead of just getting personal and attacking every individual name out there, maybe we can kind of just kind of make a broader category. Say these are the things you need to look out for, and kind of go from there as a prudential distinction.
Okay,
thing.
Sounds good.
So, okay, I guess maybe well, people ask us, for example, Father, what do you think about so-and-so, Jocko or David Goggins, they kind of like, because my boys are really interested in it, excuse me. And they seem like they really have some like motivational things. Okay, this is just
on a natural level.
On a natural level.
Yeah.
So this is category one, let's say, like these self-motivational speakers. And we get asked about it a lot. And on the one hand, self-motivation is very good. Agency is very good. But we can compare, kind of the content of the message, and I'm saying this more impersonally now because I don't know. But you do hear things like, a man is supposed to fight. When was the last time you woke up seeing red and tasting blood? It's kind of like this idea of being the beast, of being the predator, of man's virtue being kind of contained in domination. It's like, okay, well, again, if that motivates you, that might have some sort of good aspect on the natural level. But by and large, if we compare that to Catholic virtue, that's not Catholic virtue. I mean, that's not the spirit of Christ. To dominate and to be militant in and of itself is really just saying passion is more important than virtue, because virtue is summed up in charity, which is founded in humility. This is not the spirit of Christ. And so is it all evil? Is it all not worth listening to? I'm not necessarily saying that, but I am saying there needs to be, at least in this category already, a bigger degree of prudence, especially when it comes to young people listening to it. We don't want to form men that are passionate over virtuous. So you go down from there. Let's say something a little bit less militant, kind of just like the more, all these self-help books, these motivational speakers, your Tony Robbins people. Again, self-motivation is great, agency is great, but we have to ask, and we have to kind of investigate, what are the goals of these sort of motivations? Who's the center of it all? Quite often, because they're not talking from the perspective of the faith, the individual starts to become kind of the center of their own universe, and then where's God? So we have to be aware of kind of an individualism versus self-denial, or docility and piety to God our Father. So that's the spirit of that's the world, let's say, of the kind of the self-motivation thing. What about then we have the category of kind of like all the names that are pushing us towards financial success, worldly success, personal gain, your Andrew Tates and that sort of thing. Again, we have to investigate what are the goals here. Like, does it start to make money or worldly success the goal? Because in a sense, I mean, that's what materialism is. It makes material success in the world, it's God.
Yeah.
And that's against the spirit of poverty. I mean, and a lot of things that go along with it. And so again, I'm kind of impersonally here. What I'm saying is that on the one hand, there can be some good aspect in it. If you really need to know how to make a successful business and this person can tell you how to do it, fine. But at the same time, the prudential aspect that we're applying to it is that this can't be the fundamental way we think. This has to be subordinate to our business morality and the spirit of poverty and things like that. Perhaps a bigger category then after that is kind of this, if we were to just sum it all up, like the political, conservative, religious, even conservative Catholic world. And there are many, many voices that go into this. And there's different groups, different individuals, and a lot of them have a lot of following, and I think for good reason, because they're legitimately intelligent men. They're legitimately educated, and they have good things to say and relevant things to say about maybe the state of the church or the state of society, whatever it is. If we were to now apply our prudence filter onto this, our distinguishing thoughts, we have to ask ourselves, first of all, if we're going to sum all these people up as like conservative thinkers, conservative commentators, what do we mean by conservatism, for example? This is one of the questions we can ask ourselves. Do I mean, just sort of like a reaction against progressive thinking? That's, often just kind of like what conservatism tends to be. Or is it a general valuing of order and reason over just, personal gain, which isn't bad, obviously, but is it, though, conservatism? If I were to ask myself, what's the Catholic principle? What do I mean by that in the traditional sense? I mean, conservatism, in the traditional sense is the adherence to the reality that truth and morals cannot change because they're based in God, period. That's what we mean by conservatism. And so if I'm listening to someone that might not have that as their foundation, I gotta be more wary than just thinking, well, this guy thinks a lot like me in a lot of ways. I love him. Yeah. So I'm gonna listen to him. Quite often their arguments might be more based on something closer to liberalism than we might think, at least a moderated liberalism, some sort of idea that there are legitimate intrinsic rights of man that might not necessarily be a right of man, like we were mentioning, as far as like the freedom of the press and things like that.
Where you end up kind of superficially coming to the same conclusion, but for different reasons.
Right. Yeah. And that's more important than we think, because we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But I mean, the principles that govern how we come to the same conclusion, but different principles, that will have a much bigger effect in different areas and in the long run than we might think. I mean, basically, what I'm arguing as far as the conservatism goes is that is there principle of tradition or conservatism based in the kingship of Christ and in the immutable laws of God, or is it something more based in a worldly scenario? Is there moral code, again, something based in the immutable nature of how God ordered creation and his divine positive law? Or is it something that's more just, legitimately good, but not necessarily based in the same principles? So you get from some of these commentators kind of wishy-washy morals as far as like, we don't like abortion, but, contraception, or as long as it's, mutual consent, questions of homosexuality, like, the principles governing those things tend to start to become more subjective and less definite the farther we get from revealed truth and a guarded notion of the natural law. All of that, the reason that's dangerous already is all of that is going to spill over into our spirituality, to how we judge the faith, how we interact with God. And a lot of times, because it has, religious aspects to it, sometimes even directly talking about the faith, we start to replace our actual spirituality, our spiritual reading, meditation, with just listening to a podcast, that has some sort of moral or religious connotation. But that simply cannot be. We can't replace our individual, our active, our internal spirituality with these kind of episodes and things like that.
Well, yeah, that all makes it more, it makes it more sinister if it's framing this whole conversation, even the whole podcast, in the terms of duty of state. And, it's one thing, again, you mentioned earlier, if you're listening to the news and it affects your peace of soul, but you really are taking this to the highest level then, and saying that this is ultimately comes down to our very reason for existing and what we're supposed to be spending our time doing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
That's okay. Exactly it. Yeah. And that also is connected to the idea that, how we judge everything is going to be based on how we think. And if we're blurring those lines, by identifying our thought with these other people, these other these commentators' thoughts, or like kind of considering them our champion because I love how he put that, and then we start to identify our thoughts with them, we're blurring the lines of our own principles. Okay. And those blurry lines, they will have worse effects further down the road. And again, more on that, and I think pretty soon. Yeah. So, overall, as far as, these different categories of intellectual influence, again, these can all be legitimate, intelligent, educated men and women, experts in their field. But what we want to make sure that we're not taking them as a fundamental thought for our lives.
Okay.
And that's because just the simple principle is that the farther we get from the thought of the church, the more likely it is that we will diverge off of objective truth. And I think it might be worth kind of taking a step back here and just saying, okay, truth then, is truth that restricted? Because that's what it sounds like. Right. Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah. To especially someone outside the church. Are you really saying that truth is just restricted to your religion?
Right.
Right. That and only a few people have access to it. Well, what we do believe, because we do believe that our Lord Jesus Christ founded one religion, and in that religion is the fullness of revelation. We do absolutely believe that only the Catholic Church contains the fullness of truth. And by fullness of truth, I'm not saying contains all the facts. You're not going to look for Super Bowl stats in a papal encyclical, obviously. But when I say fullness of truth, I mean the fullness of the revelation that God gave to mankind about himself, who is truth. So the religion that contains that fullness of revelation is the one that's going to be said to contain the fullness of truth. We absolutely believe that. And only, again, even insofar as, the ones preaching that faith are faithful to it, as it's always been taught. It's interesting that, these kind of hard lines almost make us uncomfortable. And I think it's because we're kind of in this atmosphere of a wishy-washy, don't offend anyone kind of world. But you could call that a restricted way of thinking.
Yeah.
Or you could look at the opposite side of that coin and say, no, when we say Catholic, we mean universal. We're not meaning this secret society has the fullness of truth. We're meaning this faith was founded by God for all men. This is for all men to access this truth, and that's why it has all the fullness of truth. It's for all men to come and access, and then thereby save their souls. So you can call that a restricted mindset, but it's really a universal one. If I have, I don't know what it is, the best vaccine to cure all of the ailments of mankind, I'm not being restricted by saying mine's the cure all, because I'll let any of you have it. Yeah. It's only if you look at kind of just the negative aspect of it that it could start to sound restricted.
No, I think it's Belloc or someone who gives the analogy of, the way the Catholic looks at it is you can drive anywhere. There's lots of roads, but we put guardrails up so that, you don't drive off a cliff. Right. And when you push back against that, even without understanding it, what you're really saying is I want to be able to choose to drive off the cliff. And so it is a restriction, right? Yeah. I think this is part of what you're saying, is that this digital world has no guardrails, right? And that's exactly the problem, right? Or it's one of the problems.
That's one of the problems. Yeah. Because are there bits of truth in all of these influential people?
Yeah,
absolutely. But the point is that there are bits, you know, and there are no guardrails. And so we're really opening up ourselves to problems. Opening up ourselves to problems. So that's the gist, I guess, of that whole idea of intellectual influence. Before we kind of finish it off, I think with more like a theological influence, which is also a relevant question. But already I can say, I mean, someone might ask, well, does that mean we don't listen to anything? Does that mean that there, you know, there's, you know, what else is there? It's like, okay, well, on the one hand, there's a lot. We have 2,000 years of Catholic teaching to be able to rely on. And also, my main answer is not just a cessation of every possible listening to anything. It's really just, it's a call for caution. It's the real answer is here to be balanced in proportion to the importance of whatever we're listening to. We have to be that much more cautious and careful. So it's one thing, you know, to listen to a podcast about bird watching and take their advice on, you know, where to best find a red-winged blackbird or something like that. But it's another thing, you know, to listen to some commentator talking about the decline of Western civilization and kind of let that destroy my day and influence, you know, just how much I trust God. You know, we're talking about something that's much more important, so I can't just take it at face value. And I have to balance that, as we'll say later, with intentional study. And sometimes the more important it is and the more risk there is of an imprudent opening up, sometimes less is more and sometimes nothing's better. When it comes to you know, possible and very subtle divergences of truth. And I think that more applies even to the younger generation as well. We really, parents at least, have to really ask themselves, how much should I allow my children to be motivated, you know, by these people that aren't necessarily motivating them to a greater practice of virtue or a more precise reasoning or whatever it is. So I think the biggest concern as far as all that goes, so now the answer is still going to be balanced, but the biggest concern, when I say in proportion to the most important things, it is when we get into questions of faith. Because it's a relevant thing. And it's relevant to especially the crisis that we're in. And so a lot of people will come and ask us, Father, what do you think about Father so-and-so or this particular channel or whatever it is? And we have to do our best to say, okay, well, prudence. And again, we can kind of apply those questions we asked earlier, like what does this do for your peace of soul? What does this do for your spiritual life? And are you able to, you know, to answer this in a principled Catholic way? So, I mean, I think so. I'm going to give what I think are the best principles. I think to govern us. Obviously, this podcast isn't going to be the time or place, you know, to really get into individuals or to really attack one ideology or another. But so just kind of the general principles, because they are relevant. And I think the best thing is that if we were to take these principles and apply them to whomever we're talking about individually, that'd be the best outcome we can hope for. So just already, if we were to ask ourselves those questions, you know, how does, you know, if I'm listening to a priest, for example, or some sort of Catholic commentator, you know, a lot of times what we find on the internet is something less of the faith, less of spirituality, and something more akin to sensationalism. You know, whether that's, you know, kind of an obsession with uncertain things like the last times, or diabolical influence, or you know, just kind of fear-based things. That's very often already a good way to say, because there's plenty of people that come to us and say, Father, I was listening to so-and-so and it's just really worried me. Should I be doing this? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing this? It's like, no, if that's taking, you know, the foundation from your peace of soul and just the foundation of you just actually wanting to pray better, to practice mental prayer, and to go to the sacraments, there's something not trustworthy there. And traditional Catholicism is not sensational by its nature. It's not obsessed with you know, dark supernatural speculation. It's not centered in fear. It's centered in confidence in God's control over everything, in the protection that he offers us. And it would be much better to stay away from the sensational side of religion, even if it has, you know, some legitimate aspects to it, or, you know, it sounds nice about this particular private revelation or things like that. It would be better to spend less time or even no time with that side, if it means then that we're freeing our mind and our soul to again deepen our spiritual life and actually learn our faith as it's been taught by the popes in centuries and things like that. So that's, I think, kind of principle number one, is that just if it's not getting us closer to our Lord, if it's not helping my peace of soul, if it's not really indisputable questions of faith, well then it's already going to be dangerous, and probably less is more, if not less is better. None is more.
None is better.
Yeah, none is better. So, okay, a little bit more broader than that. Let's say, if we exit the realm of sensationalism, just get into more like, I guess kind of Catholic doctrine. Obviously, there are a lot of different voices, a lot of different priests from different backgrounds, posting things and commentating on things online, and obviously, this can get, to be a very delicate question, because we don't want to be, the intention here is not to be sinking anybody's boat or to undermining anyone, or at the same time, getting anything more personal than just what are the principles of faith here. And when I say principles of faith, I do mean the principles of traditional faith, as the church has always taught in the context of the crisis of the church. So, Here's I guess kind of the chain of reasoning. The first principle is that, at least here within our Society of St. Pius X, we absolutely believe that there's a crisis in the church.
Sure.
And we absolutely believe that crisis, as pointed out by St. Pius X, is the crisis of modernism, this whole idea of kind of man over God, or man against God, this idea of the evolution of truth, things like that. And then in particular, when it came to how that was manifested in the Second Vatican Council, what we usually point to is like, okay, we have serious theological issues with religious liberty, with false ecumenism, with collegiality, with the kind of the modern idea of the structure of the church, because we believe that they're based in modernism. And that's in our best judgment, that's the basis, that's the heart of the crisis in the church. And so what Archbishop Lefebvre, what his goal was to have a priesthood, to preserve a priesthood that was free from those ideas. And that's exactly what he gave us in the formation that we received in the seminary and the statutes of the society. And that's actually the reason why, for example, we don't offer the Novus Ordo Missae, because we believe it's a product of those principles. And so then the conclusion of that first line of reasoning is just a priori, without any, further knowledge or judgment of any individual, we don't trust the formation that's a result of the Second Vatican Council, or let's say kind of like the theology of the Novus Ordo Missae, because of those principles. First and foremostly, because we do not trust the principles in which they are founded. And that's why the society is always cautioned about, where you're going to mass or what you're listening to, because those little divergences of theology, they might be subtle for sure, but they do have absolutely real effects. So if we were to draw a couple lines, for example, the results of the principles of religious liberty, even though they were in some ways very subtle in the council documents, or ecumenism, the results of those ended up being, the scandal of the CC in 86, or, even the Pachamama in more recent times. So these are results of a mentality that was already opening itself up to like that kind of spirit of false ecumenism, things like that. Or let's say the effects of the principle of collegiality that was laid down in the council would be, kind of this crazy, almost quasi-schismatic synod of synodality that we're kind of groaning under today. It's a causal link behind that idea and these effects that we're seeing. Or the effects of kind of just like the blurring of certain moral principles, or the idea that morals and truth cannot change, brings us to more recent scandals of the quasi blessing of illicit unions and things like that. And all these things are connected, and these blurring lines is that is the effect of modernism, and it brings about a gradual weakening of principles and of morals. And so, prudently speaking, now, if we're to just take that's the concern, we prudently do not want to expose ourselves to that. Because the result is in us could be a wishy-washy theology, a wishy-washy kind of sense of morals, it brings confusion, discord, unnecessary strife, because now we're, with some sort of half-baked principle, we're arguing against this particular judgment or motive, and then we're getting caught up in the dichotomy between truth and charity or kindness or whatever it is. But at the bottom line, like that kind of wishy-washy, that in uncertainty, that blurred line, that's not going to aid the crisis in the church. It's not going to produce vocations. It's not going to help us, solidly just steer our family according to what the church has always taught. So that's our concern. That's the prudent conclusion.
So can I throw out an example to see if I'm tracking you? I think to tie what you were saying right there with something you mentioned earlier, the problem is something potentially like this. I find someone on YouTube. Let's say I go to the traditional mass. Let's even say I go to a society. I'm a faithful of the society chapel. I find a YouTube priest who also is promoting the traditional mass, and I think, well, that's great. I like the traditional mass too. He's clearly, talking about the traditional mass, but the principle behind is that for him it's a preference. It's, sure. I mean, it's a real preference, and that's great. But our reasons are obviously not just much different, but much beyond preferential. And if you then sort of like almost inductively absorb the principles that, this is a question of taste, preference, then you're leading to that wishy-washiness of principles, which actually will undermine your duty of state and your family if you don't understand the real reasons why.
Exactly. And it has a kind of a double effect. It has that, it'll undermine the solidity of your own principles and how you apply that to your family. But also looking outside of yourself, you're going to start to have, difficulties with maybe the actions or the judgments of a priest of the society. Like, well, how can you say that? That's totally unkind. This is just a question of preference. Like, well, how are we fighting that battle all of a sudden? Right. So where did that come from? That gradual weakening of principles, and quite frankly, we see it as priests. The more there's sort of a concession granted, certain things start to go.
Interesting.
Whether that's just at first it's like an absolute adherence to traditional liturgy, and that might start to have little exceptions here and there, and that trickles into the insistence of traditional Catholic education. That'll trickle into even like moral questions, just even simple things like questions of modesty and things like that. And you see it. It's just kind of like this gradual decline, and then it becomes that much more difficult to reason, because now we're kind of trying to like have a discussion with two different points of view and two different, intellectual building blocks. So it's a big deal, and I think the most dangerous thing about it is that it's so darn hard to see. Most people think, well, I'm not going to let myself be taken in. Like, I would know. Like, well, and that's kind of the whole thing behind it. The reason why it is dangerous is because you're not necessarily going to notice. I mean, that's what wishy-washy theology is. It's gonna state something imprecise and then be able to bring about a different conclusion farther down the road. For example, I was reading a book about the fatherhood of God, and someone gave it to me, and it was very interesting. It was well done, written by a priest, and not one of our priests, but I think he has some very, very good things. But one of his conclusions was, as far as the priest is concerned, he said the first and foremost importance, the first principle that a priest's first duty is to be a father to his flock. And then, kind of goes on from there and gives different examples and things like that. And that struck me at first. Okay, that sounds nice, but something doesn't seem right. And then eventually kind of struck me. It's like, okay, well, no, that's definitely not what I was taught in the seminary. What was continually pounded both in the writings of Archbishop Lefebvre and the different spiritual writers that we were, constantly given, was that the priest's first and foremost duty is to be a son to the Father. To care for our own soul, to work for the glory of God, to be, docile and subordinate to Him, and then secondarily, through the union with Christ, then be a father to our own children. And that might seem subtle, but it's a fundamental difference. I mean, in a sense, that's the difference between the old Mass and the new Mass, is who we're putting the focus on. and the different conclusions that these days are becoming more and more obvious and scandalous, they're all based in those same principles. So it's dangerous, and the biggest danger is that it's subtle. I mean, you're not gonna. So that's why a lot of times, I mean, again, just prudently speaking, less is more when it comes to these more important things. And quite frankly, the consensus of me and my fellow priests is that a lot less is a lot more, or maybe even none is best, because there are a lot of other sources, traditional sources. Yeah. Even if it takes a little bit more time and study, there are other ways to learn our faith that are maybe just a little bit less convenient, let's say. But I mean, we do have to kind of state it frankly sometimes. I mean, for example, just, for one of our faithful to be continuously listening to some commentary on the New Catechism of the Church, for example, which is the fruit of the council, which is the heart of the source of the crisis, and at the same time to adhere to being a faithful in one of our chapels, it's antithetical, and it doesn't work a priori. At least it's imprudent. So without knowing more, okay, I'm not making like a big declamation or declaration. It's just there's a basic syllogism that we're establishing as the source of our prudence. Modernism is the foundation of the new theology, let's say, and is the source of the more concrete scandals that we see today. It's antithetical to the faith, and it's dangerous to the soul, dangerous to souls. And for that, for the evidence of that, we point to the major decline, the loss of vocations, conversions, parishes, the scandals, all those things. Modernism is the foundation, and it's dangerous. This particular person or priest or commentary or book is formed and founded in that context of at least drawing on it as principles, and so therefore it's dangerous. Yeah, that's just the basic prudential kind of process of thought here. And at this point, a lot of times people say, but Father, there's no alternatives. How do you keep saying there's other things to do? But, we don't find, we can't find the society priest always giving commentary on this sort of thing. And like, well, okay. On the one hand, it's okay. We can't, match every possible, source of commentary out there. But on the other hand, it's not necessary. Again, sometimes nothing is better, or maybe even just an audiobook of literature if you just need something to listen to. But there is much more. I mean, we have 2,000 years of Catholic writing. We have the Church Fathers. We have all the doctors of the Church. We have all these saints. Even right up until recent times, some of the best spiritual writings that we give to people are from authors of the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, because they're so more relevant to us. Yeah. We have a whole bookstore. We have so much, and at the very, very basis, I mean, for hundreds of years, Catholics nourished their spiritual life just off of scripture, and even like little bits of scripture they can get. That was Lectio Divina. That was kind of just the heartbeat of the monastic orders. Sure. So to say that there's no alternatives is a shallow way of thinking. And it's better for us to, on the one hand, be okay with the notion of drawing some hard lines. And we don't like that because, again, that's not what we're kind of trained to do. That's not the world we live in. But the hard line is that we do have one soul, and we have one purpose. There's one truth, there's one way, there's one faith, there's one revelation rather. There's one revolution too. Yeah. Yeah, right. But blurring the lines, letting in a worldly spirit, it's not going to produce strong Catholics. It'll produce worldly, worried, fearful, disinterested, wishy-washy, no vocations. That's not what we're interested in. So drawing some hard lines and these more important things, it's becoming more and more necessary. And for everything else, then we go back to that question of balance. If not never, for whatever kind of commentator or topic we're talking about, then we have to proportion it. Proportion time, let's say, to actively studying, getting a book, getting a papal encyclical, knowing your faith, knowing the crisis actively, not just passively, reading, And then the other thing we have to proportion it to is prayer. I mean, if most of our day, especially most of our intellectual work, is spent on just listening, that's not proportionate to our duty of state as Catholics, or just letting our day be filled with news feeds or whatever other things we can listen to. We have to make intentionally actively work to produce space for proportionate time for prayer, for just time with God. Because the more exposure we give ourselves, the more we put ourselves in passivity to the universal truth and the universal goodness, the more that's going to inundate our principles, and the more he is going to, direct how we judge. But that doesn't happen magically. We have to put ourselves in passivity to the right source of truth, and we have to let him be the agent. And there's simply nothing that can replace that. No digital spirituality can replace that. It has to be something that, and I think that's the best conclusion I can give, is that, if it's not, sometimes nothing is better, then the best answer is balance with study, balance with prayer. Okay. And if we're doing that, if we're really looking at, okay, now we're doing, our best to follow our duty as Catholics to not be swept away by the influences of the digital feeds, whether that's the cultural influences, the consumer, or the intellectual influences.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Father. That's all tremendously helpful, and I think it does answer, or at least puts into perspective and answers who puts what on the screen and what we're supposed to do, at least by way of response, or what principles we should have in our mind. From here, we're going to go into a few different areas. Do you want to just say a few words about what the next few episodes will be about?
Sure. Yeah, we've been talking about, just kind of where to go from here. I think the plan is to kind of tackle the two big, more moral difficulties, especially. The first one being social media and its effects on us, and especially the effects on our children. And how it opens up to other more moral difficulties. And then, what could be called the big elephant in the room is pornography, which is, kind of the state of the internet. And we're going to try and understand everything we can about it, and then how to practically respond to that reality. And then from there, we're going to get, I think, more practical. So we'll start talking about, different ways that we can practically, safeguard our family, our own souls, even, trying to get even as practical as, just how to set things up. Maybe we'll see how far we can get with all that. But that's, I think, the direction we're heading.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Father.
Sure thing.